Welcome everyone. This is an update on the progress of WCAG 3, which I've given a tagline of A Long Road to a New Model. I'm Alastair Campbell from a company called Nomensa, but I'm speaking today as co-chair of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group at the W3C. So what is WCAG 3? We're talking about a new set of accessibility guidelines from the W3C. Whilst version 3 maintains the acronym, there is a lot changing under the surface. They're, for starters, not intended to be backwards compatible. One aspect is the name, as it now stands for W3C Accessibility Guidelines rather than Web Content. The reference to content has been dropped, which is a subtle indicator of the increased scope of the guidelines. You might have heard of it referenced as Silver, and that name is still around. But Silver is the name for the project and task force that created the guidelines. It was a nickname formed from the initials for accessibility guidelines, also matching the chemical symbol for silver. So where is the work being done? And I'm showing a rough diagram of where the groups involved in creating WCAG 3 sit. So within W3C, we have the large Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, which has several task forces, including the Silver Task Force. The Silver Task Force has several subgroups that form and disband to work on specific items, such as guidelines, or the conformance model. The Silver Community Group has also been an important method of expanding participation beyond those who can join the W3C to gather input from more people. I include the W3C membership and the director on this diagram because when specifications like this are created, they have to be approved by both. This does tend to be a lot of work, but it really helps to have industry approval for accessibility standards so they're seen as feasible and robust. In terms of when is this work happening? Well, the thinking and working towards a new version of the guidelines has been in progress since, I think, the early 2010s. However, officially the task force was formed in late 2016. The first part of the work was to do some research, following a user-centered design process by engaging with various people with disabilities as well as stakeholders across the industry. Then work started on the guidelines as well as the conformance model. There's a certain chicken and egg problem to get over, as the conformance model will impose a certain structure on the guidelines, and the guidelines will have certain requirements of the structure. The working group has come to an initial draft with a small but wide sample of guidelines to test the conformance and structure of the proposal. And there's lots of time allocated to both updating the structure and creating the guidelines within the new structure, so the likely publication date is 2023. The facilitators of the task force are Jean Spellman and Sean Laureat, who've led the project. Rochelle Montgomery and Michael Cooper have also been heavily involved in editing the draft recently. And myself and Charles Adams will get more involved over time as it becomes the main focus of the working group. So the goals WCAG 3 is working towards are based on the research which led to the requirements for Silver. And these requirements do help to highlight the differences from the previous approach in WCAG 2. We'd like to better address a broader range of user needs and accommodate new technologies such as virtual reality and augmented reality. We'd like to incorporate tool guidance with authoring guidance to avoid the accessibility support challenge of WCAG 2. And define clearer testing procedures and allow for multiple approaches. So each guideline could have a different way of testing it, not just a true-false statement. And we'd like to allow for more frequent updates to the standard while still meeting the needs of policymakers. We'd also like to define ways to conformance that don't use the unit of web page, so perhaps more process orientated. And reduce the reading complexity where possible. Now, there will still need to be some technical information available, obviously, but at least the very starting point of the guideline and the main help information for each guideline should be easy to read. And we'd like to base any updated guidance on research where feasible and emphasise the importance of future research and building that in. And the way we expect WCAG 3 to meet these goals is by changing the structure of the guidelines and the conformance model and updating the content. So the actual requirements from the previous guidelines are not expected to radically change. They're good and necessary things to do. However, they will be expressed differently and added to. So let's start with the structure, and we'll go through an example. But to start with, the structure of the guidelines starts off with a guideline, and this time the actual things we're calling guidelines will be the guideline. At the moment they're called success criteria. So starting with an understandable explanation of the requirement that should be easy to understand for policymakers, people who are new to accessibility, just about anyone. Then we've got underneath the guidelines outcomes. So these are testable criteria that include information on how to score the outcome in an optional conformance claim. They're not necessarily true-false statements that WCAG 2 uses though, and we'll come on to an example. Underneath outcomes we have methods, which is detailed information on how to meet the outcome. So it could be code examples, working examples, resources, as well as information about testing and scoring the method. A bit like techniques, but with more around them. So as an example, I picked text alternatives because it's available in the WCAG 2 and the first draft of WCAG 3. So the guideline for that is provide text alternative for non-text content. Pretty straightforward. The outcome then sounds a little bit more like our current success criteria. So a text alternative for non-text content is available via user agents and assistive technologies, which allows users who are unable to perceive and or understand the non-text content to determine its meaning. This focuses on how you know the requirement is met, regardless of how it's met. So in that way it's separated from the content, and it could be achieved by the author, the authoring tool, or even the user agent. And the methods underneath the outcomes are usually a list of technology-specific ways of meeting the outcome, and therefore the guideline. So looking at a method for text alternatives, it has a introduction, description, examples, tests, and resources. I think I have that here. So each of these is a tab on a web page with the different information. I think tests will be particularly interesting for anyone involved in auditing or testing. And then we also have how-to information. So if you're familiar with the understanding documents in WCAG 2, the how-to documents in WCAG 3 provide significantly more guidance. So each of these tabs, plan, design, develop, are aimed at common perspectives that were outlined from the research. And then I'm going to bring in the concept of atomic tests. So we've got atomic and holistic tests. And the atomic tests is what the first draft is going to focus on. So testing is either scoped to a view or a process. And each outcome has a section that shows how it is scored. And there are several types we can go through. So we've got tests that result in a pass or fail condition that will be assigned 100% or 0%. For example, whether the language of the page is set is basically true or false. So that will either score 100 or 0. Tests that are at the element level that can be consistently counted can be assigned a percentage. So for example, alt text. If you've got 95% of alt texts are assigned, that is your percentage. Alt texts that meet the criteria written. Then there are tests that could apply to content without clear boundaries, maybe a clear language guideline, for example, and that could be scored using a rating scale. And we also have a concept of critical errors. So within a process, if you have a critical error, that's going to result in a score of 0. So those are the atomic tests that are similar, or they're building upon sort of concepts we've had previously. Holistic tests are intended to be included in a later draft, which would include more usability-orientated methods, such as testing with assistive technology, user-centered design methods, and user or expert usability testing. So if you're going through and scoring, you can create an overall score. So the results from these atomic tests are aggregated. If there are critical errors, I'm afraid that leads to 0. But if you meet a certain score, currently we've set that at 90%. Across each functional category, you can meet the base level of conformance. Now, these functional categories are basically things like vision and visual, language and literacy, and each guideline will be assigned to one or more functional categories, so you build up a score within each functional category. And I would note, if this is getting complicated, the guidelines can be used for good practice without scoring or without using the scoring or conformance at all. That is a stated aim of these guidelines. It should be good information for making things accessible. However, for those who do wish to make a conformance claim, you would scope your claim, so it would apply to certain views and processes. The scope can be all content of your digital product, but more often it's going to be one or more subsets of the whole based on the processes and views. Now, having gone through that scoring, each functional category score will be normalized to a kind of 0 to 5, and we do expect to have very standardized spreadsheets for doing this type of activity. And then to get your sort of overall conformance score, you must have no critical errors, score at least 3.5 on average, and at least 3.5 within each functional category. So it is more complex than a simple find one issue and you fail, but it is intended to be a bit more nuanced and allow for good practice without, the enemy of the perfect. So in this presentation, I've outlined very quickly the new structure, which aims to provide more flexibility, to be easier to use, and a conformance model that better reflects the experience for people with disabilities. The first public working draft is being published. It may be published by the time you see this, and we are encouraging feedback at what is quite an early stage because it is far from finished. The conformance model and scoring are key areas for us to get feedback on, particularly because it will affect how the guidelines are created and put into the new structure. GitHub issues is the best place for public feedback, although emails to the editors, which are at the top of the document, are also welcome. So thank you very much. The link here hopefully will be available somewhere for you to click on. We'll get you to these slides and all the links are active. And if you'd like to get involved, please do. We would welcome more input.